Thank you very much, Don. Thanks, Rob. Hope this wireless technology works. For healthcare, anyway, I wouldn't trust this technology, but let's see what happens. Here we go. It's not working. That's great. Fantastic. Okay, so as Don said, I cross the board between academe and effectively industry. And what's really nice about being an academic is that you can be pretty opportunistic in the sort of research that you do. But when you need venture capitalist money, everything becomes strategic. So I'm going to cross the board now, and I'm going to show you how we've really tried to take some of these really interesting biomedical ideas, and particularly in an environment where you really have to have the medical community liaising, integrating, and actually researching with the electrical, mechanical, civil, chemical, engineering community. It's all about interdisciplinarity. So I want to get across some of that message. But Don has been a particular inspiration to me as well, because, you know, the whole concept of, you know, the human body being the next application of wireless health. I mean, this is something that I remember Don talking about some 10 years ago or so. So now it's taken a decade to see this whole application domain of engineering with medicine becoming a reality. And as we know, the sort of the engineering community has been invigorated by the application of medicine, and so we'll see now how some of those techniques will come to fruition. So when I started off thinking of a title for this presentation, the initial thoughts were, should I call it the bionic man or the bionic woman? You know, we're looking at body implants, we're looking at wireless technology. Probably a lot of you, or some of you, remember the sort of bionic woman, maybe, Lindsay Wagner or Steve Austin, the $6 Million Man. This American soap that portrayed humans to be super, with super hearing, super sight, super touch, super smell. What I want to get across today is not a technology that makes better humans, but that makes humans better. So it's really the application to that domain that's really interesting. Now, I'm a bit of an imposter because my general background is basically semiconductors. I come from a wireless semiconductor background. Most of my life, or sort of academic life, I've been working on very low power semiconductors for radio frequency technology. The norm, looking at applications of CMOS, low power CMOS at the front end of these sort of widgets called mobile phones and lots of other types of technologies. Well, about 10 years ago, my honeymoon into the medical area became really apparent when I was approached by a company in Canada who'd produced this fascinating electrode array. And this electrode array was used for cochlear prosthetics. It was an array that behaved very much like the proboscis of a butterfly, a spiral array that could be implanted in the inner ear and made physical contact to the nervous tissue in the eighth nerve. Now, what was beautiful about this technology is that the electrodes burnt almost zero power, or not very much power, because of the fact that the electrodes made physical contact to the nerve, so not relying upon the conductivity of the fluid to make the connection. And as a result, this meant that there was a potential there to effectively implant these electrodes. This was for born deaf children, and instead of having this whacking great digital signal processing chip and processor outside the ear, maybe now there's a potential to integrate everything with the biology inside the ear. So effectively, after about 3 years, we helped to create one of the world's first totally implantable cochlear chips using ultra-low power semiconductor technology. And it demonstrated to me that if you just apply a fraction of this technology to healthcare, you can make major innovation. And that was really my honeymoon into this particular area. And then, you know, we saw the new wave of technology happening 5-10 years ago, the whole quality of life, people living longer. Now, I might bore you for the next 40 minutes because I'm going to carry on giving this sort of presentation. But apparently, for every 5 minutes, you'll all live by 1 second. So I'll give you at least 8 seconds of life after this presentation. That's the rapid growth of technology and how it's affecting healthcare today. Now, it's not just about making sick people better. It's not just about making unhealthy people healthy, but it's also about making healthy people healthier. So from early detection right through to therapy, that's where this sort of technology can play a very pivotal and key role. Now, I run an institute as well in London, similar to the sort of health institute here, the Wireless Health Institute here in San Diego. The objective being really to mix the ingredients to make the cake. It's all about interdisciplinarity. The building we created in South Kensington in London about 5 years ago was opened by the Queen in 2007. It's one of the largest sort of biomedical institutes in Europe. The idea being to focus very, very much in the integration between electrical engineers, chemists, and medics. That's really the driver of that particular institute. And we've kept the target to be pretty much disruptive technology. We've heard that word before, but come on, guys, this is truly disruptive. When you're applying something that we spent billions of dollars on and understand consumerism, now we're applying it to healthcare. So the whole new business strategies, business models, how do we leverage semiconductors in healthcare? Because there's no money in components anymore when you leverage healthcare. The money's in the solution, and it's all about connectivity. And you'll hear a bit more about that in a moment. So it's very much around trying to make healthcare consumer products. My background is consumer, so let's see how we can leverage consumer and move away just from this being a fashion accessory, but for the good of mankind. I mean, that's effectively the driver of this sort of technology. Now, it's true in the States, it's true in the UK, it's true in Europe. The government is spending almost 80% of its healthcare budget on chronic disease management. And generally, that's because, you know, people are moving out of the hospital into the home quicker, so we need to sustain that. We're looking at ways in which we can help the aged population. Demographics changing, we're seeing more people living over 65 than under 16. So effectively, we've got this whole new demographic change in the aged population. But that's not the main reason, the main excuse for driving these technologies. We've also got serious issues. Obesity has become an epidemic in the UK now. I thought it was just an American problem, but it's huge. In fact, that picture was taken from the States on the left. The one on the right is a UK actor. Anyway, but effectively, we are seeing this. Type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, etc., etc. So managing these diseases, early detection as well as compliance of technologies to make sure that people do go to the gym, that whole area where wireless is so important is becoming now a key to this sort of technology. Now, when you look at something like this, though, this is a slide I drew maybe 6-7 years ago, and things haven't changed very much. What's wireless about that? That's technology in the home. It's still pretty primitive. Yet we've got all this sophisticated technology, and we're still deploying primitive devices like that. I guess that when you imagine a picture where that then becomes wireless, and this individual walking around, so instead of the cigarette in the ashtray on the left there, he's having a fag outside and can be measured. You know, that's the sort of technology that we'll be able to deploy soon. So why is that technology still looking primitive? Well, it's up to this community to try and change that mindset and that trend. And you can see what are the technology needs for something like this. We've effectively got, we need to have 24/7 monitoring, we need disposability, these things have to be cost effective. So there's a whole driver to try and push technology to meet these requirements. Now, this is where I want to make a sort of position statement. Although I'm an analog designer, I spent many years developing what we call, I mentioned before, the radio frequency, the bit that interfaces between digital and analog. Because over the years, the digital egg has been getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and the analog shell has been getting thinner and thinner and thinner and thinner, and it's cracking. And all this digital has been squirting out, and there's been megabucks for RF engineers. That's been the driver of the classical sort of digital world technology. In bio, things have changed. So I'm glad I concentrated on analog, because my belief is that the world is analog. Biology is analog. Speech, sound, we don't see with 20 bits, we don't hear with 20 bits of precision. Biology doesn't work with that digital precision. So this is effectively a renaissance of the analog world now back into the sort of biospace. And we recognized that several years ago and started to think, well, actually, if we can do a lot of the biological things in an analog domain and interface to biology and do this on the biology, and then we've reversed the whole process because now the egg is analog and the shell is digital. So the world has become digital. So we need now to interface between the analog world and the digital world. So why the digital revolution? We all know the ones and zeros. We even graduate engineers still with flat fingers and ones and zeros pouring out of their ears. I mean, it's still a digital world. We're starting now to change that dynamic. We saw the transistor invented in the 40s. We saw the integrated circuit by Kilby, and then we saw more come along. And now we've got 4 billion transistors on some semiconductor CMOS. So fantastic for the digital world. But my point is, I think that we've come to the sort of end of the Moore's law curve, if you like, if we're just focusing on functionality and looking at modeling and creating biological functions out of semiconductors. So let's bring back those famous analog laws from the archives. Remember Kirchhoff, remember Ohm's law, those famous, really, the physics of the semiconductor now needs to come back in a really powerful way to start to replicate and, if you like, replace and monitor biological functions. I mean, one of my heroes, without getting too academic, is a guy called Boltzmann, and Boltzmann's distribution of energy, the difference between kinetic and thermal energy. There he showed this whole thing followed an exponential type characteristic. That's exactly the same way that electrons flow in a transistor with their diffusion levels. You all understand how a semiconductor works. You've got that relationship between voltage and current, and it all follows that beautiful distribution of energy, that exponential characteristic. Why am I showing that? Because in nervous tissue, in biology, ions are in a thermal equilibrium with their surroundings. So they also follow that Boltzmann distribution. So if you like modulate ionic membrane with a particular voltage, then the ionic movement also follows exactly that exponential behavior. And effectively, that's not news. In fact, you know, there was a Nobel Prize around it by Hodgkin and Huxley many years ago, where they took the squid axon and demonstrated that the physics of nonlinear conductances of sodium, potassium, ionic behavior in the squid axon followed exactly those exponential Boltzmann characteristics. And so why I'm showing that is you can see here there's great analogy between the physics of biology and the physics of semiconductors. It's now today that semiconductors are so small and so low power that we can start to replicate that physics. We've got nanometer technologies now, so we can start to integrate semiconductors with biology in a really, really effective way. We can do simple functions like logs and anti-logs. Remember your old log tables where you log two numbers and anti-log to get multiplication? You can do that now out of semiconductors in a very simple analog computational way. You can make differential equations, nonlinear and linear, all out of very simple. I don't need a million digital logic gates that are churning lots of power to create this differential equation. I can do it very simply out of the physics. Okay, what am I trading? Okay, I've only got 8 bits instead of 20 bits. But I don't need more than 8 bits when I'm interfacing to biology. And that's the real power management trade-off that we can start looking at. So one of the first examples we looked at 5 or so years ago was the cochlear implant. The cochlea is the heart of the ear, which when defective results in stone deafness. Its function is to take a time-varying pressure wave and convert it into something like 20,000 hair cells that connect to the 8th nerve in the ear. But what's beautiful about the cochlea, it's very much like a spiral tube. One end, or the basilar membrane actually, which is inside the cochlea, it's a spiral tube. If you unravel it, one end is quite thick and the other end is quite flabby. And along the surface, you've got those 20,000 hair cells. So a high-frequency pressure wave will cause the thick end to vibrate, and a low-frequency pressure wave will cause the flabby end to vibrate. So what you have is a traveling wave along the surface of that basilar membrane. Well, for me, a traveling wave is just a spectrum analyzer. you've effectively got 20,000 hair cells with different frequency spectra, like a radio, along the surface. So hey, why don't we try and model that? We all know about radio. We all know about sort of spectrum analyzers. So we took that dynamic and we looked at using the idea of this implantable spiral electrode from this company in Canada, and along the surface we wanted to create the spatial equivalent to a spectrum analyzer. And we did that. We created one of the world's lowest power semiconductor chips out of weak inversion analog CMOS technology. We modeled the whole analog processor out of CMOS. We looked at the interface, log compression, etc., and we produced this chip. And this chip was less at that time, I think several years ago, was less than 10 microwatts in power, 8 bits of precision, but it was 2 orders of magnitude lower power than the world's fastest, lowest power DSP to do the same functionality. And that chip then got deployed into the bottom cochlear implant that you see there. Now it's been used in a number of born deaf children, and it works. It was licensed to a company in Innsbruck, and now effectively this demonstrated that, again, biology has got this fantastic plasticity. In fact, we only used 16 electrodes instead of the 20,000 that you would need if you tried to model the real cochlea. And just with 16 electrodes, the brain took over. And the brain's plasticity and regeneration problems took something quite inaccurate and gave that child legible hearing. So you can show how interfacing to biology has got a very, very good bio-inspired adaptability. Spot the monkey. Come on, the guy on the left, right? No. Yes, I hope you spotted number 2. Okay, well, the reason I've shown you that is that you spotted that monkey instantaneously. However, the best digital computer on the planet could not have spotted that monkey instantaneously. Our ability to access, process, store, and ship out large amounts of information instantaneously makes the retina the fastest, most computationally efficient, if you like, processor, or image processor that you could ever imagine. So how come that can do this, yet the best digital computer can't? Yet the brain of a common housefly, smaller than a grain of rice, could also do this instantaneously. Well, the retina, as we know, is the only bit of the brain that sticks out of the head. It's basically a fantastic piece of neuronal wetware. It's got a photopic range of 17 bits, a temporal resolution of about 10 hertz. And if you put that into perspective, if you do the calculations, it means that the retina is processing at a rate of 10 gigabits per second. It's taking 10 gigabits per second of processing, and it's shipping out this data with only 100 milliwatts of power, computational power. Isn't that amazing? Imagine you'd need so many car batteries to run a DSP to do the same sort of computational drive. And that's because the retina has all this local intelligence. And I'm going to get to the point in a minute of this whole bioinspiration. The point being that the retina takes in all this light through its pupil. And then along the back of the retina, you've got something like 100 million photoreceptors made up of cones and rods. Cones are the rods are the black and white, and cones are the color. And effectively, that mixture, you take the light, it absorbs that, it then takes these photoreceptors, take that light energy and convert it into electrical energy, which stimulate 1 million ganglion cells, which are the intelligent cells, which compress that signal in an intelligent way and send it to the optic nerve. Now, the point here is that on each of those pixels, you've got local intelligence. Everything is done locally. You've got automatic, if you like, quantization, gain control, local spatial temporal filtering. Everything is done locally. So effectively, we've got an intelligent pixel. The eye has an intelligent pixel. So therefore, why don't we take that paradigm and do our wireless processing? Why can't we be as efficient? Because power now is prerequisite. Everybody wants low power. So why can't we take the analogy to that? Well, we basically have. I mean, this is just a couple of slides to show that we've worked on retinal implants, and we've looked at trying to use that idea of an intelligent pixel for subretinal retinal prosthetics. But the important point for this particular conference is all around this idea, therefore, of saying, if we've got a number of sensors, let's try and do a lot of the number crunching intelligence locally on that sensor. And then let's just send the results of the data in the same way as the eye does it. And that way we've got efficiency, we've got low bandwidth, low power, and things can be done intelligently on that sensor. So that paradigm we took about 10 years ago and tried to capitalize on it by creating a company called Toumaz Technology. The whole idea being that if we can now, on the body, do things intelligently with bio-inspiration, because this is inspired by biology, then we can create these paradigms. And we created this paradigm called AMX technology. To the venture capital world, you know, you can't talk too much bio-inspired. You've got to be straightforward here. So I called it advanced mixed signal technology, basically. It's mixing analog and digital, but the analog is behaving very much now like the digital used to, but for the bio side of things. And the digital bit is the connectivity, if you like, to the cloud. And the cloud wasn't invented as a term then, but I put it on the slide recently because it shows that the way things are going about sort of information systems and the back end. And we created, therefore, on the way to this connectivity, this device called a Sensium, and not a Pentium. The Sensium being the Pentium equivalent for the biospace, this sensor interface. You've got sensor interfacing, you've got local processing, and you've got wireless technology. And we looked at this as being almost a connectivity hub for that first meter, for the human space. This was launched through a company called Toumaz Technology, and how you would package that Sensium comes with different guises. You can package it in a sort of digital band-aid, you can package it with a non-disposable patch, but the whole idea is within that you've got all the local processing that can take physiological data, number crunch it, then just send its results off. And it can all be done in an ultra-low power way. So the company was set up. One of the first sort of Sensium devices that we created looks at heart rate, looks at temperature, looks at full ECG, looks at movement, looks at respiration. The whole idea being that you've got this worn on your body and you can go about your daily life, and this is then wirelessly transmitting on a continuous basis. Why continuous? I think sometimes we forget one of the big differences between analog and digital is continuous. Because continuous information means that this now becomes preventative medicine. It means if one can detect something that otherwise would not have been detected, then that's early detection. And early detection becomes preventative medicine. And that's where all the big savings are. And that's the sort of driver of this sort of technology. And so we've labeled it sort of the Sensium, which is the connectivity hub to the service. But what we want to capture as a business is just that front end. Just that first meter, from the biology to, as Don Wood said, to the web. You know? So bringing the whole things together, the IP address of your organs, so to speak. And so you can take a big whacking great Holter monitor now that's wired up, or an ECG monitor, and you can replace it with a patch or some non-disposable device that is worn on the body that continuously monitors your vital sign parameters. Just looking at the time. Okay, so if we move along now to this slide, this was one of the first demonstrations we did. In fact, this was an interesting demonstration because I wore one of these patches several years ago when it's not working, my heart stopped. Okay, in fact, when the Queen opened the Institute in London, I was brave enough to wear one of these devices. And I shouldn't have really, because my ECG was all over the place. Now, I had a very famous medic next to the Queen. His name was Sir Magdi Yaqub. He's done more heart transplants than anybody else on the planet. So he stood next to the Queen, and my heart was going all over the place. Can't get it to go at the moment. Anyway, you see my ECG there. And basically, I was saying to Magdi, the surgeon next to the Queen, how am I doing? How am I doing? And he was standing there looking. I said, Magdi, how's my heart doing? And after about 1 minute of pressing him, and the Queen was right next to him, he said, I don't know how to turn this ruddy thing on, okay? And to me, that was a classic demonstration of where it might go wrong. Here we are, sophisticated technology, but at the end of the day, it's the user that we've got to worry about. It's the human factors, the whole aspect of trying to get this technology to be used by the clinician, who, by the way, is no longer the prima donna. The engineer is becoming the prima donna in this particular area. So you can see how now this sort of acceptance by the medical community is one of the major things that we're going to have to defeat. So moving along to the next slide. Also, this technology is useful for well-being, and I just thought I'd put that slide up there, but just general for lifestyle monitoring, not just, as I said, for making the sick people better. Also, we're looking at applying this technology at the Olympics, looking at ways in for sports. You know, sports medicine is really important, and therefore trying to get wireless technology on sportsmen, but looking at true clinical behavior, which is really important. True clinical behavior is so much more important than just looking at sort of if your heart rate's okay or your breathing's okay. So the whole aspect of this technology is effectively the connectivity from a home environment into your service, and it's out of the hospital and into the home where we really need to see consumerism. Now, the last bit of the talk, I want to take you somewhere where we can still use wireless technologies, but where I think semiconductors are going to play a key role. And I've called it once the sort of merge between the East and the West Coast in this country. The whole idea is life sciences and semiconductors in life sciences. So we started looking at these semiconductors about 10 years ago, and we found that this chap in Holland called Bergveld took a normal semiconductor transistor and said, actually, if we look at what's going on in that device, we've got this nice metal called silicon nitride, which is the layer below the polysilicon layer that effectively connects to your electrical gate. If you just expose that silicon nitride layer on its own and get rid of the electrical gate, that silicon nitride layer, if there are any biochemists in here, is chemically sensitive. It's a really good membrane for chemical sensitivity. So if you now introduce leave that exposed, so leave that silicon nitride layer exposed, connect it through an electrolyte, and then go straight to an electrode. What you've then created is effectively a chemical sensor. And so within that electrolyte, any protons that get released cause hydrogen ion concentrations. As a result of hydrogen ion concentrations, you get effective pH changes. And with this device, there's a direct relationship between the change in pH and the electrical characteristics of that transistor. Now, what's really fantastic here is that in your traditional semiconductor CMOS technology, silicon nitride comes for free. It's the passivation layer within the technology. So you can exploit that layer to make chemically sensitive devices. So the first application we looked at, and this is being used now in patients at St. Mary's Hospital in the UK, was a closed-loop diabetes artificial pancreas, a bio-inspired artificial pancreas. We took, if you look first of all at what's happened with type 1 diabetes over the years, things haven't really changed. Insulin was invented, and this is 100-year-old, this slide, and this poor child on the left had type 1 diabetes. After being given insulin, then look at the health of that child. Okay, he's got no limbs, he lost his limbs, but he survived for a while. That was the start of deployment, of diffusion of insulin into type 1 diabetics. But over the century, things haven't really changed. The technology is still pretty primitive. You have to take a blood level, then you have to inject insulin. It's still is an old Wellcome slide in 1933 to 2009, and the technology is still the same. You take a blood sample and then you secrete insulin. So what do we want to try and do here? How can we help with that problem? So if you look, for example, where the fundamental problem is, if you remember I showed you the slide with the child with no limbs, the reason that he lost his limbs is because of hyperglycemia. The fact is that there's a physiological range that we all need to stay within to keep our glucose levels sustained. And unless we've got, therefore, like the biology, like the pancreas, a continuous secretion of insulin on a level that's changing based upon your diet, your exercise, and whatever you do, effectively then you're going to fall out of that physiological range. And as soon as you fall out of that range, that's when you get all these side effects due to hypoglycemia. You lose retinopathy, you lose your limbs, you lose your legs, etc., you lose your sight, you lose your kidneys. This is all secondary effects because you're not controlled continuously within that range. So what we need is the word continuous, and we need to find a way where wireless technologies can help with this sort of idea. And these are some of the side effects which I don't want to labour too much. So what we did is we worked with some cell biologists in the clinic, in the medical school at Imperial College, and we took the pancreas and we looked within the pancreas. And the pancreas is made up of these islets of beta cells and alpha cells. The beta cells are the intelligent cells, the key cells that generate the insulin as a result of your glucose levels. So it's excitosis. So effectively the beta cells take the amount of glucose that you've got, and intelligently they work out how much insulin you need. And if you remember the bioinspiration I mentioned earlier with the cochlea, then effectively the beta cells are also intelligent neurons. And if you look at that spiking pattern, the longer that spiking is on, the more insulin that's secreted. The shorter it's on, the less insulin that's secreted. So if we can take the dynamics and note the sort of nonlinear dynamics of that beta cell and try and model it out of a semiconductor in the way that we did with the cochlea, then we can make an intelligent beta cell and therefore an artificial pancreas. So we did that. We took the dynamics of those beta cells, we created them out of low-power semiconductor technology, and then we replicated the behavior of those beta cells. Now, the important thing is, this is the layer that we need if we're going to make our closed-loop artificial pancreas system truly personalized. Because now we're modeling it upon the dynamics of the true beta cell of that individual. So we took that chip, we took a glucose sensor. There are many companies now developing closed-loop glucose sensors. Johnson & Johnson, Medtronic, Roche, etc. We took an insulin pump, we took our chip and controlled the pump with that chip. So the pump is now intelligent. We then took the sensor, connected it to the peritoneal cavity. We're looking at interstitial fluid. We don't need blood. We can use interstitial fluid to measure the glucose levels. We then take the pump, we connect the two things together, and we have a wireless monitor to make sure when the patient is asleep that we're not going outside of those ranges, just a manual interface. So effectively what we've done now is we've provided both the diagnostic and the therapy at the same point. And this is effectively one of the first intelligent bio-inspired closed loop. It's a physiologically closed loop artificial pancreas. It's not based upon some three-term controller or something, some control theory. This is based upon the biology. So we're hoping the results of these first clinical trials will lead to fruition. The last subject, and then I'll stop. Just moving away from that to this last subject, which I think is a really interesting subject, is the whole area of early detection. We've looked at therapy, we've looked at diagnostics. Now I want to talk very, very briefly about early detection. One of the big problems with these ion-sensitive transistors that I talked about is drift. That is why these things have really, really not taken off. Now with processing and new advances in the semiconductor technology, we can reduce drift. So they're starting to get deployed. But I was thinking a few years ago, I think around 5 years ago or so, what in biology doesn't drift? Well, DNA doesn't drift. So can we not use these semiconductors to measure DNA? You know, the full genome now has been discovered, 3 billion bases. We're looking at SNPs, etc., in the biology. So what we decided to do was to basically look at the way biology, look at the way these single nucleotides get incorporated in biology. We took these ISFETs. We know that there's a relationship between pH and electrical current. I'm not going to go into the equations at all. But what I wanted to show you here is that we put on the surface just DNA. And when an A matched with a T or a C matched with a G, the transistor switched on. Effectively, there was such a rapid change in pH that for the first time we demonstrated we could use a semiconductor, not light, not optics, but a semiconductor as a means of detecting DNA. And so we patented this idea around 2003, and in fact, we licensed this technology in March to a company called Ion Torrent. We licensed it non-exclusively, by the way, and they've just sold to Life Technologies for $750 million US. So this is going to revolutionize DNA sequencing, because what it's doing now, it's using semiconductors, simple semiconductors. We coined the idea, we set up a company called DNA Electronics. The semiconductor chip now replaces these big electrophoresis or photophoresis sequencing machines. The technique is very simple. It's base extension. I'm not going to go through the way it works. But we coined this thing DNA logic, which is the same as digital logic, but instead of the input being ones and zeros, we've got DNA into our logic gates. And that has resulted in this new idea of effectively now using Moore's law, using semiconductors, and seeing how actually sequencing is taking over. How we can now have so many bases on a piece of silicon, and how we can get down to the $1,000 genome using the sort of Moore's law technology. And it's not just for sequencing. We can use it, for example, you go to your clinician. We've got this handheld device that we've developed. Each chip is for a different disease or a different drug. You basically go to your patient, your GP can basically take a saliva sample and say, this is the right drug for you. Pharmacogenomics, companion diagnostics. So for every drug, we believe there will be a mutation chip or a SNP chip. And effectively, the result now you can get in 15 minutes or 10 minutes. Our latest is 10 minutes instead of waiting 2 weeks to get a result from a sequencing lab. So that's truly personalized. And you can see that, the ineffectiveness of drugs and how this is going to be important. You've got the consumer genetics area now, where you still have to send things off to a lab to get it back. Now we can maybe use wireless technologies and do things on the spot to get your DNA and your SNPs. So I'm going to finish now. We've also applied this to virus detection and chips for things like HIV, et cetera, et cetera. So I'll stop there. Just to say then, so what I've demonstrated, I've just given you a glimpse of a few things that are happening, but my push is really semiconductors is really becoming big time in healthcare, particularly now with the life science industry starting to deploy semiconductors for sequencing applications as well. But it does take engineering, for example, silicon design. It takes physics of semiconductors. It takes medicine, say deafness. It takes life sciences, bacillar membrane behavior to create the cake. So interdisciplinarity is so important to make these things happen. And just to finish with a quote from an old English philosopher writer called William Gibson, the future's already arrived, it's just not evenly distributed yet. And I think that's the key to this sort of technology. So a few acknowledgements, so thank you very much.
Chris, will you take a few questions from the audience? Raise your hand, because we won't see you. Wave around a little bit if you've got. Come on, you can't all be shy.
Is this on? Yep. So since you've licensed Sensium to TI, I was just wondering what the uptake of Sensium has been among the device companies since your licensing arrangement.
Yeah. We licensed to TI a few years ago, but the thing that we licensed to TI was much more, the value proposition wasn't really around a connectivity device. It was really just seeing where low power processing can replace things in pacemakers, etc. Where the big drive for us is, it's not just licensing a component or a semiconductor chip. It's looking at licensing the connectivity, because I think that's where the value is. And that's the model that we're starting to push now with a number of the big corporates. So we're moving away from a component business, as I said earlier. The sort of, you can make a few bucks from a semiconductor chip, but you can make loads of dollars if you're looking at value in a solution and not in just a front end. Oh yeah, we've done a lot of these human factor studies. I mean, that's critical, actually, and that's something that's required now even by FDA in this sort of technology. So you know, this disruption, it has got very important ramifications on the way both patients and nurses and clinicians and healthcare workers will start to use it. So absolutely, we've done a lot of work in that area. Yeah.
In the DNA electronics,
Oh yeah, we can go down to nanoliters, and we can using the method that we've got, we actually because PCR polymerase chain also the amplification also gives you pH output. It's hybridization in the same way. We can both amplify and detect simultaneously. So we don't need a preamplifier in the way conventional optical sequencing methods work. So the sample prep is all done locally, instantaneously as we go into the well.
Chris, would you address, you've worked both sides of the Atlantic here, from both the science and business perspective, and would you just address a little bit about your experiences? Sometimes when we work with companies in Europe, there's sometimes a potentially bias to be European focused, and sometimes maybe the same thing in the U.S. You've actually worked both sides and bridged both sides with some global companies. Can you talk about that process as you translate from silicon biology to the actual business?
Yeah. Well, I think we've got this wretched organisation called the NHS in the UK, which to disrupt anything in the NHS is really, really difficult. And one of the things that I found working here in the States is your bullishness in trying to push new technologies into healthcare. So from a technological perspective, I think that's really, really important. I think because we haven't had, in Europe particularly, or in the UK, a sort of semiconductor industry in the way you guys have, and sort of my take is on semiconductors for healthcare, what we're finding is that the business models of moving away from, as I mentioned to the gentleman there, the semiconductor being a component to the semiconductor being almost the enabler to a solution. And it's that change in mindset and those business models that I think the industries that we're working with over here are finding it difficult to adapt to. So, you know, but we do need, you know, you guys have got the brands. So if we're going to basically deploy these technologies and disrupt both hospitals and home health, you know, then this sort of technology does need to sit on the back of the bulldozers to get these things into the system. So until the bulldozers understand the business models, I think we're going to be stuck. And I think you're trying to sort of bulldoze Qualcomm as being one of those that understands these business models, Don. So that's my general take.
I have one question. You said you were trying to license the connection to the body. My question to you is, what is your solution to a long-term connectivity due to the body's response to the implant itself and affecting the local chemical, physiochemical general area? Such as your sensor to glucose, you're saying the interstitial fluids, you're monitoring the glucose level at that level. Yeah. What happens when you have the inflammatory response developing in a large regional physiochemical versus what the global physiochemical composition is? I was just wondering if you have an approach to that.
I wasn't quite sure of it. I mean, the idea of using interstitial fluid has been around for a long time. I mean, one of the difficulties has always been the delay, and therefore when it comes to a closed loop system, people haven't been, or companies haven't been that successful because there is this sort of non-linear delay that takes place between the glucose in the interstitial fluid and the true glucose in the blood level. But, you know, there are now, Medtronic, for example, and Roche and others have started to look at measurement of interstitial fluid in a very successful way. So in terms of all we're doing is we're just finding a simpler way of closing the loop, because I think the dynamics of a normal PID controller don't seem to give the physiological, if you like, regeneration that one might need. In fact, the technology that we've talked about just now was applicable to type 1 diabetic, where your pancreas is completely packed up. But we're looking now at deploying it for type 2 diabetics, where you've actually got glucagon still working, your alpha cells are still functional, your beta cells are still functional to some degree, and this could almost act as a stimulation to those beta cells that are active. So, you know, in terms of what's happening globally, I think this is, I'm working with the Diabetes Centre in the UK. They're one of the world's sort of global diabetes centres. Sorry?
So I guess I should rephrase my question, since I'm talking within the body itself.
Well, this is not, see, what we've got here is exactly the same way as a catheter would work for renal dialysis. This is a catheter that will stick out of the peritoneal cavity, so it's not implanted. Yeah, it's not an implanted system. So it's minimally invasive. So it's based upon a standard catheter tube with the chip and the pump on that surface. So yeah, so that's hence not going straight to the blood, but going to the interstitial fluid.